This week's Bible study is on Psalm 9, verses 9 to 20. Please read through the passage before you watch this video, and you may find it helpful to have it open in front of you while you listen. Psalms 9 and 10 are often both taken together to be one larger unit, so you might find it helpful to read through from the very beginning of Psalm 9 to the end of Psalm 10 in one go, to get a sense of the overall mood and theme. These two psalms appear to go round in a bit of a triangle, and this can be seen in the section of Psalm 9 that we're looking at today. One part of the triangle is the adversary who is causing distress to the speaker. This enemy is identified in the psalm as the wicked in verses 16 and 17, or as the nations at various points from verses 15 to 20. The second part of the triangle is the speaker of the psalm, who is portrayed as oppressed in verse 9, afflicted in verse 12, suffering in verse 13, and needy and poor both in verse 18. There is some suggestion that the speaker could be the king in the middle of a really difficult time, but actually we don't really need to know who the speaker is. The important thing is that whoever is speaking, and this could be any believer in need, they are weak and helpless in the face of their enemies. The balance of power is unequal, and the speaker cannot stand against their adversaries. If these are the only two players in the drama, we know what the outcome will be. The enemy appears to have the strength, the superior force in comparison to the psalmist, and if things remain the same, the speaker will remain disadvantaged and will likely be defeated. But thankfully, this is not the end of the story, and thankfully there are more than two characters in play. The focus in the psalm is on the third part of the triangle, Yahweh, who is the powerful equalizer. God alters the balance of social power so that the strong oppressor cannot win, and the weaker person crying out for help will be able to come out of the situation in a good place. This psalm asserts that social power is never a drama between two unequal parts, but that God, the third party, is always included and always decisively transforms each situation. Everything depends on God, and God always acts to reshape reality. Verses 9 to 12 are a song of praise which announces the presence of God and asserts that God is a player in the speaker's current situation. If you like, they sing God into playing a part in the conflict that's about to happen. God is the safe place for the oppressed who have no other sanctuary. Those who have no resources and no refuge can depend on God and can trust that God will help because God is always faithful. After this hymn of praise comes a prayer in verse 13. The psalmist asks God to once again be the one who, in verse 12, avenges blood, and who will protect the one who suffers and is oppressed. In the poetry of the Psalms, any troubling and distressing situation is described as the threat of death, and here the prayer for help is made in confidence that God will answer. Then verses 14 to 18 return to praise. In fact, the praise is partly offered as a motivation to God to act. If God acts soon, then the psalmist can return to singing praise and telling everyone about the wonderful things God has done. Verses 15 to 18 give us an example of the recounting mentioned in verse 14. In celebration of God, they tell how the nations who had dug a pit and hidden a net to trap the speaker have actually fallen into their own pit and been trapped by their own net. The speaker has escaped, and although it is not explicitly mentioned, the implication is that it is God who has kept him safe and turned the tables on the oppressors. With God in the mix, things don't turn out as you would expect, and the anticipated outcome of victory for the powerful is overturned. On the basis of this great affirmation of God's activity, Psalm 9 ends with a strong plea in verses 19 and 20, which echoes the petition of verse 13. The psalmist does not doubt what God can do. God can do anything. The job of the psalmist is to motivate God to action. The psalmist wants God to rise up and get a move on, to do the things that the psalmist knows God can do. When God acts on behalf of the marginalised and forgotten, it becomes clear that the powerful are not as strong as they think they are. There is a reminder that however powerful these oppressors think they are, at the end of the day, they are mortals, verse 19. They are only human, verse 20. The power of God casts a new light on human hubris and pretentiousness, which Brueggemann describes as almost all hot air. He writes, "And when the hot air evaporates before the real power of God, the weak are safe and have room for the living of their life. The very ones who are vulnerable and exposed now can be buoyant and celebrate. The difference in their situation is the powerful move of God, which staggers human history." If you would like to reflect on this passage further, there are some questions you might want to consider. Firstly, read through this passage again slowly. If you have time, read through the whole of Psalms 9 and 10 first, and then go back over 9 verses 9 to 20 2 or 3 times. Pay attention to any words or phrases that stand out for you. How do you respond to the idea that with God in the mix, the balance of power is altered? How do you respond to the idea that God is the great equaliser of human power? What do you make of the idea that those who seek to do harm to the psalmist actually find themselves harmed by their own plans and schemes? How does this affect the way you might think or behave when it seems that people are conspiring against you or seeking to do you harm? In what ways do you think God might be asking you to be an answer to someone's prayer for help this week? Pay special attention to the people you encounter this week, or to situations you hear about in the news, and ask God to help you see what God would have you do in order to be a safe place for somebody else. In what ways do you feel that you are facing difficult situations at the moment? How difficult or easy do you find it to share the psalmist's confidence and trust? Are there ever times when you are reluctant to call on God for help? Why might this be so? Pray through the psalm once again, offering your own situation to God and the needs of those you know who are facing trouble and oppression of any kind today.